have the time and take a stroll in your mind. In August of '64, a Tonkin Gulf incident ignites a war. Admiral Morrison gets attacked, then America strikes back. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon. Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.
Welcome to part 5 of my summary of Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. This episode covers Chapter 7, The Death of Godo Paulekas. If you haven't seen episodes 1 through 5, I'll leave a link in a pinned comment. Thanks for watching. Chapter 7, The Death of Godo Paulekas, Anger's Infant Lucifer.
Vito would come in every night with an entourage, mostly 4 or 5 really great-looking girls. It's a weird parallel, but it was like a non-violent Manson situation, a little cult.
Lou Adner, manager-producer of the Mamas and Papas, the co-organizer of the Monterey Pop Festival, investor in Jay Sebring's hair salon, and business partner of mobster club owner Elmer Valentine. I have said for years that there were some similarities between Vito and Manson. Vito was sort of like a pimp. He was welcome as a VIP with the emerging rock crowd because he always showed up with these free-thinking 14 and 15-year-old girls who would be happy to satisfy their needs. A member of the Paulekas family, in email correspondence with the author. Recruits for Vito and Carl's dance group weren't likely that hard to come by. According to Barry Miles, Vito operated
the first crash pad in LA, an open house to countless runaways where everyone was welcome for a night, particularly young women.
By the mid-1960s, the group had expanded into a second communal location in addition to Vito's pad to the ubiquitous log cabin, Tom Nix's old place. By 1967, the dancers were splitting their rent at the log cabin with the staff of the hippie publication The Oracle. There was at least 36 people living and partying at the log cabin and treehouse, including the band Fraternity of Man. For the record, Fraternity of Man was a one-hit wonder band best known for the ever-popular novelty song, Don't Bogart Me. Also, Timothy Leary lived there, and, in this writer's opinion, best known for being a painfully obvious CIA asset. The Oracle was a San Francisco-based publication with intelligence ties that specialized in pitching psychedelic occultism to impressionable youth. Leary, it probably should be noted, also had a home of his own in Laurel Canyon. Franzoni's commune ended in May of 1968. That was when the Oracle moved out and our old friend Frank Zappa moved in. The lead mother had visited Carl at the log cabin on a previous trip and realized it was perfect for his needs. And it was an easy move for Frank since he was already living in Laurel Canyon at the home of Pamela Zarubica, a.k.a. Susie Cream Cheese, at 8404 Kirkwood Drive, where Zappa had met his new wife Gail and where Gail's old kindergarten pal Jim Morrison was known to occasionally pass the time. Miss Cream Cheese was yet another member of Vito's dance troupe. According to multiple sources, Barry Miles is mistaken in his contention that Franzoni's commune came to an end. Frank Zappa took over as ringmaster, to be sure, but Franzoni, he stayed on. He lived in the basement and was known to bowl in the midnight, usually naked and intoxicated. The doomed Christine Frica had a room down there as well, as did the other future GTOs. Miles noted correctly that the freak dancers became so closely associated with the Mothers of Invention that they got dubbed as the Mothers Auxiliary, and Carl Franzoni, in particular, was included in a lot of group photographs. Vito and Carl also received vocal credits on the band's debut album, as did none other than Bobby Beausoleil. And that in a nutshell is the story of Vito and his freak dancers, or at least the sanitized version. Because there's also a very dark underbelly to this story. And much of it centered around the angelic hippie child that the readers of Life magazine met in 1966, and who we must now sadly add to the Laurel Canyon death list. For young Godot Paulekas, you see, never made it past the age of 3. The specifics of the tragedy are difficult to determine, unfortunately, as there's little agreement in the various accounts of the event. According to Barry Miles,
Vito and Szou's 3-year-old son, Godot, had fallen through a trapdoor on the roof of the building and died.
the author goes through quotes from a number of people on their accounts of what happened, and really all it does is muddy the waters. So muddy, in fact, that in addition to there being various compelling fell from the scaffolding, fell through the trapdoor, crashed through the skylight accounts, there are also at least 2 medical malpractice stories. We also know that Vito and Szou's had a rather odd reaction to the death of their firstborn son and only child, as recounted by Des Barres.
I was beside myself with sorrow, but Vito and Szou insisted on continuing our plans for the evening. We went out dancing, and when people asked where little Godot was, Vito said, "He died today." It was weird, really weird.
Barry Miles, who was also close to the scene, had a similar recollection, though he attempted to put a more positive spin on the reaction of the parents.
Vito and Szou's 3-year-old son, Godot, had fallen through a trapdoor on the roof of their building and died. That evening, Vito, Szou, and the gang went out as usual, dancing with an even fiercer intensity to assuage their grief.
Godot died at 7:30 p.m. on December 23, 1966, some 36 hours before Christmas morning. On the side of reality that I live on, the death of a child at any time would deter most parents from going out and partying the night away. That it occurred virtually on Christmas Eve makes Vito and Szou's actions that much more incomprehensible. Adding to the weirdness factor is the full text of a quote from the San Francisco Weekly.
Kenneth Anger's first candidate to play Lucifer, a 5-year-old boy whose hippie parents had been fixtures on the Los Angeles counterculture scene, fell through a skylight to his death. By 1967, Anger had relocated to San Francisco and was searching for a new Lucifer.
He soon found his new Lucifer in the form of Mansonite and former grassroots guitarist Bobby Beaujolais. And so it was that the soon-to-be convicted murderer replaced a cherubic hippie child as the face of Lucifer. Pamela Desbarres has shed further light on the dark edges of the freak troupe, with this description of a scene that Vito had staged one evening in his studio.
2 tenderly young girls were tonguing each other. Everyone was silently observing the scene as if it were part of their necessary training by the headmaster Vito. One of the girls on the 4-poster was only 12 years old. And a few months later, Vito was deported to Tahiti for this very situation, and many more just like it.
It was actually Haiti that Vito appears to have fled to, and then to Jamaica, which at the time had no extradition treaty with the United States. He was accompanied by his wife Szou's and their new baby daughter, Groovy Nipples Paulekas, born on June 23, 1967. The couple would have several more offspring, each given an increasingly ridiculous name. B.P. Paulekas, born on December 29, 1969, Sky Paulekas, born bizarrely enough on what would have been Godot's 8th birthday, December 1, 1971, and Freakus Magikas Paulekas, born January 28, 1974, just a little more than a year before the couple divorced in March of 1975 in Northern California. Vito's flight from justice occurred in December of 1968, although some accounts vary. Carl Franzoni, meanwhile, became embroiled in some unspecific legal troubles of his own and went into hiding, later resurfacing in Canada by some reports. At around that time, Frank Zappa moved on to yet another location in Laurel Canyon, a high-security home on Woodrow Wilson Drive. Also around that same time, the Manson family came calling at the log cabin. One former Manson family associate claims that a group of 4 to 6 family members lived at the log cabin for a few weeks in late 1968. Applebaum took over Vito's place when Vito vacated, so he inherited all the people that came after that. He was the beginning of the Manson clan. Manson came there because he had heard about Vito, but Vito was gone. It makes perfect sense, in retrospect, that Charles Manson and his family came calling just as Vito fled the scene, and that a Mansonite replaced the freak child as the embodiment of Lucifer. For the truth, you see, is that in many significant ways, Charles Manson was little more than a younger version of Vito Paulekas. Consider, if you will, all the following Manson-esque qualities that Paulekas, and to some extent Franzoni, seem to share. Vito considered himself to be a gifted artist and poet, as did our old friend Charlie Manson. Vito, according to Miles,
Was something of a guru.
as was, quite obviously, Chuck Manson. Vito surrounded himself with a flock of very young, often underage, women, as did Manson. Vito was considerably older than his followers, and so too was Charlie. When Vito addressed his flock, they listened with rapt attention as though they were being delivered the word of God, as was true with Manson as well. Carl Franzoni was known to wear a black cape and refer to himself as Captain Fuck, while Manson was also partial to black capes and would at times declare himself to be the god of fuck. Vito is said to have had a virtually insatiable libido, as did, by numerous reports, Chuck Manson. Vito's flock adopted nicknames to aid in the depersonalization process, as did Charlie's. Vito's troupe included a Beverly Hills hairstylist named Sheldon Jamin, while Charlie's included a Beverly Hills hairpiece stylist named Charles Watson. Vito believed in introducing children to duality at a very young age, while in the Manson family, as Sanders had noted, infant duality was encouraged. Vito apparently liked to stage live sex shows for his followers involving underage participants, which was also a specialty of Charles Millis Manson. Finally, Vito encouraged his followers to drug themselves while he himself largely abstained, thus enabling him to at all times maintain control, while Manson limited his own drug intake for the very same reason. Franzoni and Manson were not, by the way, the only folks on the Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene who developed a fondness for black capes in the latter half of the 1960s. As Michael Walker noted in Laurel Canyon, during the same time period, David Crosby had taken to wearing an Oscar Wilde, Frank Lloyd Wright-ish type cape wherever he went. In unrelated news, Ed Sanders notes in his controversial The Family that around March 10, 1968, a convoy of 7 process automobiles containing 30 people and 14 Alsatian dogs journeyed towards Los Angeles. Vincent Belowski added in his best-selling Helter Skelter that in 1968 and 1969, the process launched a major recruiting drive in the United States. They were in Los Angeles in May and June of 1968, and for at least several months in the fall of 1969. As Gary Lachman wrote in the Fortean Times in May of 2000, the Process Church of the Final Judgement, often referred to as just the Process, was one of the most controversial cults of the 60s. Formed in 1963 in London as an offshoot of Scientology, the group was the brainchild of Robert Moore, a former cavalry officer who would soon adopt the name Robert de Grimson, and Marianne McLean, the proprietor of an elite prostitution ring with ties to the UK's so-called Profumo affair. The group arrived in the States in 1968, establishing roots in Los Angeles, San Francisco, New Orleans, New York, and Boston. The organization soon began producing a magazine that, as Lachman says, had an editorial policy that favored Hitler, Satan, and gore. What a combo, huh? The cult's fascist mindset was amply illustrated by their choice of a symbol, which Lachman accurately describes as bearing an uncanny resemblance to the Nazi swastika. In The Family, Sanders describes the process as a death-worshipping cult composed of hooded snuffoids who were directly connected to the Manson murders. Spokespersons for the cult, not surprisingly, vehemently denied any involvement in any such murderous activities. One thing is certain, though, processians were instantly recognizable in the streets of LA due to their curious habit of donning black capes wherever they went. By the early 1970s, Vito Paulekas had resurfaced up north in Kodai, California, with Carl Franzoni once again at his side. The two were, by all accounts, treated like rock stars in the funky little town. They are to this day featured on the city's official website. By some accounts, Vito even served as mayor of the town, with Franzoni assisting as his directors of parks and recreation. Paulekas also taught dance classes at Sonoma State College. Szou went to work for an attorney, leaving hippie life behind. Franzoni, meanwhile, turned up on The Gong Show, apparently as one of the worm dancers. The Gong Show, of course, was the brainchild of Chuck Barris, who famously claimed that during the days when he appeared to be working as a mild-mannered game show producer, he was actually on the payroll of the CIA, and that while he was ostensibly serving as a chaperone to the couples who had won trips on the dating game, what he was really doing was carrying out assassinations. Possibly like that hairy Houdini guy who we'll discuss in a later chapter. Anyway, during the 1970s, the Captain and Treehouse scene grew more creepy than it actually was before. Eric Burden of the Animals moved in after Zappa vacated, and the property continued to be communally occupied. In fact, it appears to remain something of a commune throughout the 70s, quite possibly right up until the time it burned to the ground on October 31st, 1981. Vito and Carl appear to have remained in Northern California throughout the 80s and into the 90s. Vito married once again, for the fourth time, while he was in his 60s. Franzoni was still milling about the Santa Rosa area as early as 2013. In 2008, a tour operator billed Franzoni as King of the Freaks, a title formerly held by his mentor Vito Paulekas. The original king, alas, had died in October of 1992. His memorial service was held, appropriately enough, on October 31st, 1992, All Hallows Eve. Returning now to the death of young Godot Paulekas, filmmaker Robert Carl Cohen said in an email defense to his medical malpractice claim that he was told by Carl Franzoni on the evening of the tragedy and retold later by Vito himself. He said that during an LA Free Press photo shoot, two older children were holding his hands and they ran about. They led him onto a white painted glass skylight which collapsed. Godot fell through, sustaining a cut to his head and bruises. They took him to the emergency rooms, but the doctors stitched a cut on his head and recommended he be taken to LA County General Hospital for observation since he may have had a concussion. A few hours later, Vito received a phone call from LA County General that Godot had died. Two autopsies revealed that Godot had no drugs in his system and that the cause of death had been strangulation due to his breathing his own vomit. Vito sued LA County for wrongful death due to medical malpractice. Supposedly, LA authorities offered Vito a $20,000 pretrial settlement, which he refused. Vito declined to change his appearance for court, and the jury ruled in favor of the hospital. A member of the Paulekas family heard a much different account, this one also coming directly from Vito.
Vito and Szou told me that Godot fell from the roof through the skylight, as often told, but died when, in the hospital, the district attorney's office insisted on testing Godot for drugs to prove Vito was drugging his own child. The best way to test was with a spinal tap that killed him because he was so young. That was his story to me, and he elaborated about his screaming child being tied down in his presence for the spinal tap and then suddenly becoming lifeless.
It's perfectly obvious that both versions of events cannot possibly be true. One version of reality holds that the boy was tested for drugs after his death, while the other version claims that the drug test was what killed him. Godot was restrained in both versions, but do you really need to work that hard to restrain a 3-year-old? And would a hospital really be so callous as to inform parents of the death of a child by the telephone? As it turns out, Godot's LA County certificate of death provided some insight into his short life and curious death. The coroner found the cause of death to be shock due to the hemorrhage into the deep cervical and superior mediastinal areas. The death was deemed to be an accident that occurred when Godot fell through the skylight while playing. Despite the fact that Godot died on December 23rd, his autopsy was not completed until April 13, a delay of nearly 4 months. To further add to the mystery, even after the body was released, it was almost another full month before it was buried. The tragedy was reported not by the parents, but by a Mr. Marvin Kahn, attorney. After a child has suffered a serious accident, do parents with nothing to hide generally delay the arrival of help by calling an attorney and having him contact the proper authorities? I guess there'll always be unanswered questions surrounding the short life and curious death of the angelic hippie child who missed his big screen debut as Lucifer. I'll let a member of the Paulekas family provide the final words on the King of the Freaks. Asked by the author if he believed Vito was a possible pedophile, he answered,
Probably. But I believe you have to go deeper into the libido and drives of so many rock stars and famous people who had an unhealthy relationship with sex and drugs. Any biography of the rockers of that time, and probably any time, just skirts around the reality that their greatest secret and shame includes the sex they had and have with very young girls and boys. Roman Polanski just got caught. I love hearing from people who tell me Vito saved their soul or protected them from danger when they were young and at risk. I am sure some became survivors, and others fell deeper into the abyss. So it goes.
Indeed. And that completes Part 5, Chapter 7 of my summary of
Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon.
If you made it this far, I really appreciate you watching. By looking at the numbers, it looks like YouTube suppresses this content, so please, you can really help me if you share, and share. We'll start working on getting the next episode out, probably be a few weeks, but until then, we'll catch you on the next episode.
Military kids depart the hill, and into the canyon they will fill. They protest people who kill, but are they any different still? Weird scenes inside the canyon. Weird scenes inside the canyon.